In 1964, Valerie married Daniel Ma, who is the son of the first Chinese Presbyterian minister, generally where everyone's families came from.
My father came from, he always said Hoc San Hui Ping. I don't really know what it means, but that's what he always says. And my mother, she was sold, so I don't really know where she's from.
Okay, thank you.
I have to write it down because I have been to the village. It's a very exciting thing to get to the village. It's a very tiny village near Luqian, near Du Phuc. Most people would say, if you know where Du Phuc is, that's where it is, in Guangdong province in Taishan County. And I have to add that my sister Ruth became a journalist, but she was allowed to go back to China, one of the very first people to go back in 1975, and to go back on a raft and back into the village. And then she said, and they took a bicycle, but when they got to this building, they said, "This is your building, this belongs to your family." And it really blew her mind, because sitting on the mantle was a picture of the three sisters, my older sister Alice, Ruth, and I, a picture my father had sent home, and to go all that way into China to go there. And then for me, when Ruth took me back to China, to go to the village and to go to the graveside, it's very exciting.
My family on my father's side is originally from Yanping, which is one of the 4 counties in southern China, the Pearl River Delta area. And my mother's family is originally from Zhongshan, which is just across the river from Macau.
So I just wanted to ask the next question, knowing where the roots of your families were. How is it that they ended up in your various smaller communities?
I was born in Prince George. My father was born in Victoria. My mother was born in Vancouver. Now, I have an Uncle Bill. My Uncle Bill was quite a character. He was built sort of like a refrigerator with a head, and he was a brawler. My Uncle Bill was a bagman. He used to go up and down the Fraser River collecting money for the gambling dens. And he came across a little restaurant in northern BC. And he talked to my dad and talked to my aunt, and everybody said, okay, we'll buy it. And my dad went up to Prince George in 1951, before he was married, and it was even before the Prince George electric train came into town. So that's how our family ended up in Prince George. He obviously eventually married my mother, and she went up there, and it was a town of at that time probably 30 Chinese. Most of them were cooks. All the cooks in my father's restaurant lived in a tiny little apartment upstairs, and just a couple of families.
My grandfather went first to Cuba, and he didn't like it there. They felt like slaves there. So a friend told him that it was not a bad life in a little town called Brockville, Ontario, and that's on the other side of Kingston. So he actually moved to Brockville. So there was this other family, in the Hong family, and then my father was in a laundry. And when you do the history, it's really exciting. One of my favorite pictures is a picture of the laundry inside with my dad in rubber boots, and a ladder leading to where they slept in the corridors, the very rude corridors upstairs. And then another picture where they're all dressed up in their whites, and it says first class laundry. And my dad wasn't in the picture, and so that helped me to figure out when he went back to China to get a wife. He went back about 18, married the first wife. A month after he came back, a daughter was born, and the wife died. So then my father ended up corresponding to a Christian Chinese girl in North Bay, which was my mother. She believed in pen pals in those days. And so she became his second wife, and there were a few years that went by, you understand. The daughter was raised by relatives in China. And so my mother came from North Bay, and as a wedding present, he gave her a sable coat, and they said she was the talk of the town in Brockville. But anyway, they opened up a restaurant, and in those days, it was a restaurant with white tablecloths because we had the laundry. We had our own laundry there, white tablecloths and napkins, and we served Malpeque oysters and lobsters from Conley, Winnipeg goulash, bear steak. He would, and so this was very different than the usual restaurants in a small town.
My uncle lived in New Glasgow, and it was around the Great Depression time. So that's how my father went to New Glasgow. But after he had a family, order to make a living, he decided to go to Halifax. And so that's how we ended up in Halifax. And that's about 2 hours away from New Glasgow.
Mary, maybe while you've got the microphone, and I'd like to ask everybody as well, like how many Chinese families were there when you were growing up?
In our days, there were about 4 main families, and the first family was Checkley's family, and ours was the second one, Ling Hao, and the third one was the Fong family, and Kay, Dada, she got the Fong family, and Karen, and then there's our Frank Lee family. So there were 4 main families.
Okay, thank you.
There were really only 2 families in Brockville. The Hong family, Mr. Hong was the one who told my grandfather about coming to Brockville, and they were grown up, and we were all born in Brockville. So there were just the 2 families, and the rest are bachelors who were involved in the other restaurants in town.
So I was just making a list, trying to remember. I think there were at least 4 or 5 Chinese families when I was growing up, including Alfie's cousins. The Yips lived down the street from us, and we played with them. There was the Chow family, and they had the Golden Pheasant restaurant, which was behind us. And then the Zhang family, and Mrs. Zhang had 10 daughters. Whoa. And they ran the 10 daughters, but then her husband died. And so she ended up running the restaurant. Yeah.
I'm just thinking of number of children, and Alfie, maybe you can tell us how many children your grandfather had.
Yes, Eileen. My grandfather, his name is Yip Sang, 2 words, S-A-N-G. And if you're interested, you can go on the internet and go on Google and type in Yip Sang, and all comes up, the whole history of Yip Sang. He came in 1861, and he did everything from 1861. He sold coal, rolled cigars in San Francisco, worked on a chuck wagon in Montana, and then in 1881 he got his break. He was hired to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway, 1881 to 1885, and he rose up to become the paymaster, which was he was trusted by the contractor, Mr. Onderdonk, who later went on. He was a civil engineer from New York City, Dutch civil engineer. But after the railway, I should mention that if you ever get a chance, go and find that movie Iron Road, which Valerie helped produce. And in that movie, there's a Chinese guy that rides a horse, and he was one of the trusted men. And Grandfather Yip is something like the fellow that rode the horse. A little bit different. Grandfather Yip, he was honest as the day was long. The guy that rode the horse, he was a little less honest. Anyway, after the railway got finished in 1885, he decided he better start his family. So he built a house in Vancouver, the big brick house, and it's still existing today. And he had 3 wives. They were installed in apartments on the 4th floor, 5th floor, and 6th floor, and every night he'd go up and down from the 4th to the 5th to the 6th floor making babies. Eventually, wife number 1 on the 4th floor, she passed away, so he sent back to China, said, send me another one, make sure she can have babies. So that's where we're from. So it's wife number 1, 2, 3, and our branch is from wife number 1A, replacement. The Yips always make sons, so he had 19 sons and 4 daughters. And can you imagine the household with 23 kids, with people passing through, girls that were ordered for families in Ontario and Manitoba, passing through, and he would look after them, and Yip sang, he fed everybody. And he had his fingers on many pies, because when you got 23 children, 3 wives, and a complete household, you better figure a way to make some money. And one of his ways of making money was to take the contract for new immigrants who arrived in Vancouver, and they were get off the ship, and they would sent to the what do they call that place? They called it Ji Doi Long, the little pig pen. And that's a jail, actually. It's not a jail. It's a holding place to make sure that the new immigrant doesn't have any disease or any TB or sickness. And after 2 months in the holding in the Ji Doi Long, or 1 month in the Ji Doi Long, the immigration would release you. In the meantime, they got to be fed. So Yip Sang got the contract to feed all these guys in the Ji Doi Long, and you show a picture of the Ji Doi Long in Victoria, which is somewhat similar. So he had, in answer to your question, 23 children and a complete pig household.
Thank you very much, Alfie. I couldn't resist asking him that question because he's from a very distinguished family. You mentioned Iron Road. I just want to tell you that the Toronto Public Library is showing the Iron Road, and journalist and author Jan Wong will be interviewing Chen Kanyan, who wrote the music for the original piece Iron Road, which is an opera, and also will be interviewing Doug Hum, who's a railroad historian. So I can't remember the date, but if you check the Toronto Public Library website, you'll be able to see that film. So, I mean, I know Alfie's talked about 23 children of Yip Sang. So I just want to ask our panel what it was like, what your experiences were as far as growing up in a small town, how your experiences have been shaped by growing up Chinese in a small town.
I can start since I have the mic in my hand. For me, growing up in Prince George, I think it really helped define my character because there were no limits to what we could do. Growing up in a small town, we weren't told that we were Chinese. Nobody ever told us that we were Chinese. We were only reminded we were Chinese when we went down to see our relatives in Vancouver and Victoria in the summertime. Other than that, in Prince George, we ran around the streets. We, caught butterflies and hummingbirds and climbed trees, and it was like a totally carefree, worry-free, trouble-free childhood. And I think as a consequence, now I don't like to be restrained or confined. And you can always see that there's something beyond, the trees in the forest. Even though there weren't a lot of Chinese in Prince George, and we weren't constantly reminded in terms of racism in Prince George per se, our parents instilled in us a very a strong respect for Chinese culture. Our parents spoke Chinese to us, but like many of us, I'm sure we just responded in English, so we understood. It's not what your parents spoke to you, it's just what they said to you that you would pick up. So we understand Chinese, but we couldn't speak Chinese very well until we moved to Vancouver, and then our whole lives changed. You couldn't ride our bicycles, had to go to Chinese school Monday, Wednesday, Friday, piano lessons Tuesday, Thursday, and then brownies in Chinatown on Saturday. So life was very, very different. But I remember in grade 2, my uncle had sent us up a small lion head, paper mache lion heads for kids, and I put it on my bicycle, and I took it to school for show and tell. And I was really proud of that because being Chinese we thought it was a great thing. And Valerie had a story to tell you about her mother and how she made them feel very proud of being Chinese. And the fact that we had extended family, you have lots of aunts and uncles, and cousins. In Prince George, there was no Chinese school. We didn't even have kindergarten. So I had an extra year of playing outside.
That's what happened. Oh, Brockville was a very proper town, and I wasn't allowed to wear shorts or any shirts, sleeves. And when you walk down the street, people would say, "Hi, good morning, Miss Ma," and tip their hat. So they knew everything that you did in this town. As a young girl, I remember going down the street to the Memorial Center with a girlfriend, and a police car went by, and I said, "They're out looking for me." And she said, "Oh, get off it." And sure enough, the police car turned around and said, "Miss Laura, your father's looking for you. When you get to the Memorial Center, call your dad, okay?" When we helped work in the restaurant, we went to high school, came back at noon hour, waited on tables, went back to school again, waited on tables, if you've come from a restaurant, you sat at the back table, you did your homework there, and you kept your eye on the front. It's the logic, and folded napkins in between. But the thing is that you're in a small town, and you really feel different. You're like in those days, I knew I was Chinese. We did customs. What other father went out at midnight and shot the gun off to ward off the spirits on Chinese New Year's, Or you dare not tell your friends in May when you went to the cemetery. Like every May you had to go to Qingming, and all the community got together to go to Qingming. And I didn't want to tell my friends I'd go to the cemetery, and we have a picnic in the cemetery. But I have to tell you a story, because one day we invited the mayor, and we had a big feast. We ordered a pig from Montreal, but the pig wasn't properly cooked, and I think he and all the rest of us got diarrhea. So a little bit embarrassing there. But it was different. We didn't go to other people's homes, and I know that as a high school student, my two older sisters, they preceded me, so they waited on tables. I was a little more rebel. I got to go to CGIT and do a lot of all Girl Guides and things like that. But I remember one day I said to my mother, "I'd like to go to the football game out of town," because all teenagers go to football games out of town. And she said no. And I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Some people let their children go because they love them, and some people won't let their children go because they love them too. So we love you, but don't go out of town." So anyway, it's just there was a little bit of difference there. There were customs we learned, and then I think it wasn't until I came to the city and started to teach that there was a little boy in my class, and I started in 58 at Regal Road, and there was one Japanese boy in the class, and his mother said to me, she said, "You have no idea how happy he is now. He comes home and he's singing," and he said, "My teacher has hair just the same color as me." And as the years have grown, I think that the customs that we learned in Brockville, we brought to the city, and my stepsister who eventually came to us said, "You guys are so old-fashioned. We stopped going to the cemetery in Hong Kong years ago, and the customs in Canada were still going that we didn't have before." So what happened is that as I taught, you tell people about Chinese New Year, and you tell them all the things like you got to clean your house and do all these things, all these wonderful customs we tell them about. You don't do it yourself, but you tell other people that's what we do. And they really started to embrace it. And I think we've come through an era where we were able to do that. So it was different, with only just the one family, but I think that's where the roots started and the pride started about being Chinese.
Well, I'm glad we didn't follow the Chinese custom too much, because I'll never be able to clean up my house. My family, we were, like I told you, we were the first or second family, and so we weren't considered a threat, because in Vancouver there were riots and everything, but we were a curiosity more than a threat. And so my father did quite well, because he had the farm, and he was always cheerful, and I mean to the outside, but not at home. And so he did well. He used to go in his wagon and sell his veggie in the market. And so the Canadians accepted him quite well. But he grew Chinese veggie for the family. And so the restaurants and laundromat, they wanted his veggie. And so he was quite happy to supply to them. But they would find every excuse and every little blemish they would point out to him.